you for joining us for Adrian Tame today for our Frank Talk with Frankston City Libraries. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Frankston City Libraries operates, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to the elders of any other communities who may be joining us today. Now, Adrian Tame has seen a lot. The former journalist, broadcaster and PR executive cut his teeth on Fleet Street in the 1960s before moving to Canada, Mexico, back to England and then on to Australia, where he landed in the Melbourne office of the tabloid Truth in 1973. Adrian has broken stories of international significance and braved Melbourne's underworld. Adrian, I'm so pleased that you could join us today.
Marnie, it's lovely of you to invite me. I'm very flattered that you should do so.
No, it's absolutely. I've finished the book now, and I, as a public relations professional by trade, I absolutely loved it. I loved hearing the antics. I loved hearing how you got to break those stories. But tell me, what compelled you to put pen to paper eventually and capture your part memoir in The Awful Truth?
Well, I started it about 10 years ago, actually, Marnie. I wrote that first chapter, tried to find somebody interested in publishing it and failed miserably. So I put it in the too hard drawer for the next decade. And then I got an agent, Jean Rickman, who was very, very good and quickly found me a publisher. So I suddenly realized, God, I've got to do this. I've got to write this book. And I guess my motivation was partly that I felt that what was happening at Truth during the decade and a half that I was there was unique. And it had certainly disappeared, that form of journalism. And it really was important that somebody make an effort to, if you like, get it down on paper so that in its absence, people could learn about it if they were interested. There had been two previous books on Truth, both of which were pretty ordinary and didn't really capture the flavor of the place. And I felt it was important to do that. So that was the main reason behind my motivation.
Absolutely. And I think capturing the flavor of the place was extremely important, because while I didn't grow up with Truth, it was sort of petering out towards the end when I would have read it.
Yep.
And probably I finished high school in the year 2000. So it was probably still not quite my age group.
Marnie, if I could interrupt for 1 second, if it's any comfort, when Truth was selling 450,000 copies a week, nobody was buying it. I found it in the back seat of a cab. Oh, occasionally I see my uncle's copy. Nobody ever confessed to going into a newsagent and shelling out for a copy.
Absolutely. And when I mentioned in the office that you were actually coming in, one of our staff members turned around and she goes, "Oh my goodness, the Truth newspaper." She said, "Dad used to bring that home and it would sit on the top of the fridge and no one was allowed to touch it."
Yep.
And she goes, "I never knew why." And I said, there was a page 3 girl, right?
Well, it wasn't just the page 3 girl. I mean, the page 3 girl was enough to put it on the top of the fridge, but there was a lot of other stuff. I mean, there were the massage parlor ads up the back, which certainly any father would not have wanted his children to see, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Now, I couldn't get over the antics of the office. I mean, I've worked in organizations that have gotten close, like early on, where you just have that memory of that one place you worked that was like no other.
Yep.
But what the anarchy of Truth? And honestly, the way journalism is sadly going today, I don't think we'll ever see anything like Truth again. But can you give us an idea of what it was like working in those offices on Latrobe Street?
Well, look, I left a lot of stuff about the antics out because I didn't think people would believe it. I mean, we used to play cricket in the office for a start.
Oh, I've done that.
But we had this amazing game that was called Getting Down. And this involved 2 people attacking a third member of staff and getting them onto the carpet and holding them down on their back for 3 seconds, as in wrestling. But it was much more than that, Marnie, because it involved a great deal of treachery. You'd go to somebody and say, "Ken hasn't been got down for about a fortnight. What can we do about it?" And in the meantime, you'd go to Ken and say, "John and I are going to be getting you down later on today, but you turn on him and I will at the same time, and we'll get him down." So all of these machinations And when Mark Dairno and Thompson took over the paper in 1980, they were, I think they were just very confused and mystified. And as Tomo said, we were very rebellious. When he came in and started throwing his weight about, we just told him to go and stick it. You know, we lived under the threat of Murdoch selling the newspaper off and losing our jobs. We lived under that threat. And as I said, it was like being in a dentist's waiting room for 3 years. And so when Tomo and Mark Day came in and started telling us what to do, we just said, not interested. What's next? And I guess that was very much the nature of the place. And Tomo particularly, after a while, got used to it and excelled at it. I mean, he was the biggest anarchist of all of us.
It's just, can you, at the very start of your book, you talk about a scene involving pig masks.
Yep.
Would you mind going through that for us, just to give an idea? It doesn't give too much away. It's the first chapter of the book.
Sure.
But it gives an idea of what on earth was going on in that office.
Right. Okay. This was my very first introduction to truth. I'd arrived in Australia, I think 2 days earlier. I knew very little about it. And I fronted up for an interview that I'd organised from the UK. And I walked into the Truth newsroom, and a lady in a leopard skin trouser suit approached me and said, "Adrian Tame." I said, "Yep." She said, "Mr. Edwards," that was the editor, is awaiting you. He's in his office," and pointed to a door. I walked through the door. There were 4 people in the room. 2 of them were naked to the waist and wearing pig masks, and they were engaging in a arm wrestling match over the desk. The other 2 were photographers, and they were taking photographs of all of this while bellowing their support for one of the pair. Now, as I walked in, the smaller of the 2 wearing pig masks tilted his mask back, and he said, "Adrian Tame," and I, trying so hard not to show my horror, amazement, incredulity, whatever you'd like to call it, trying so hard to hide that, I said, "Yep." And he said, "This won't take long," put his mask back on and continued with the pig mask. So I sat there trying as hard as I could to look nonchalant. After it was over, he explained that it was a promo photo for the paper, and his opponent, Paul Edwards' opponent, was I think it was Sam Kekovic actually, who was an AFL footballer. So that was my very first introduction to the place. An incident that came about, I think, on my 3rd or 4th day, which was even more bizarre, involved an elderly man, beautifully dressed in a 3-piece suit, baseball boots, and a straw boater, came into the office and announced that he was a member of the Flying Leotards trapeze group, and he'd lost contact with the other 2 members. He said he wanted to find them so that they could go back on the road again. And this bloke was about 80 years of age. Now, a very acerbic reporter called Phil Ackman immediately took issue with this and challenged him and said, "You're far too old for any kind of trapeze work." And the bloke said, "No, I'm not." And Phil said, "Well, get up on the desk and walk over the desk. Let's see what you can do." So he leapt up very sprightly for an 80-year-old onto Phil's desk, minced across the top of his desk and jumped off the other side, and then turned to Phil and said, "Let's see you do it." So Phil gets up on the desk, and the leotard rugby tackles him to the ground. And then there's a pile-on of people, some of them on Phil's side, some of them on the leotard side. And at that moment, the door to Paul Edwards, the editor's office, opened, and I saw Paul's head poke out. And I thought, there's going to be trouble. And his head went back in. I thought, God, that's strange. The next minute, he re-emerged with an acoustic guitar around his neck, walked over to the side of where all of this mad, total chaos that was going on the floor. And he started singing and playing Mr. Bojangles. And I sat up the back of the room, and I'm thinking, this is beyond weird, but there's something about it I really like. And it was then that I knew that I was going to be very happy there.
Absolutely. And I guess without the characters who came together over all those years, Truth just wouldn't have had the anything go attitude that it did. Was it the people who made the paper?
Much the people. If Truth had been populated by today's journalists who, as far as I can see, spend most of their time on the telephone, they don't get out and meet people. They rewrite media releases, doing as they're told by the PR industry. And there aren't the rebels and the kind of people that populated Truth. I mean, just one example was J.J. McRoach, who before he joined Truth, stood for election for the Marijuana Party of Australia. And he launched his election program on the back of an elephant. Now, McRoach was fairly typical of the characters that were there. But I mean, if we had been populated by the earnest, very serious sort of people that seem to be involved in journalism today, I think it would have lost 90% of its character. The one unforgivable sin in the Truth newsroom was pomposity and taking yourself seriously. And we had one bloke who arrived with a little tiny holster on his leg with a gun in it, and he took himself so seriously. He was quite convinced that he was walking a tightrope of danger, so he wore this little gun. We were busily working out how to humiliate him over this. And one day he came back from lunch late and sober, which, as I said in the book, was an unforgivable combination. And the chief sub, Chris Smith, asked him where he'd been. He said, "Oh, I had to sort somebody out in the pub." And we're thinking, God, did he use the pistol? And somebody said, "What happened?" And he said, "Oh, it was one of the barmen, a big bloke, and I knotted him across the bar, hit him, broke his nose with my forehead." And Smithy looked at him coldly for a while, and then he said, "You could get into big trouble with that. Assault with an empty weapon is a serious matter." And that was the kind of response that anybody who took themselves seriously got in the place. So I guess that engendered the atmosphere that you're talking about.
Absolutely. Now, you did mention the change in the way that journalism is done these days, or I guess there would still be a handful of what I would call traditional journalists.
Oh, yeah. Some of the old school.
Well, I was only saying earlier this week, having studied journalism myself at university, we didn't get taught investigative journalism. And I think that's something, it's that where you were saying how to pick out a liar and how to find the truth in what somebody's saying. You can't teach that.
No, the hidden motives behind a media release. What's the real agenda? And sitting in a classroom in a university listening to a lecturer is not where you learn the abilities to deal with that sort of thing. You learn them on the street and in the pubs, and you learn them through communication with people. And in the old days, that's what journalists did. They went out and they met people and they communicated with them. And I fear that with a few notable exceptions, most of the journalists today don't have that interaction with their readers, with their public. So, and it's a great loss. And I think one of the things that we did at Truth was give a cadetship to the copy boys who were able to get the hamburger orders right. I mean, you'd have a room full of 10 people and everybody would have a different hamburger. Mine's double beetroot, no egg. Mine's double bacon, no cheese. And if they got that right for 2 or 3 months, we figured they might just possibly make a good journalist because at least they were accurate. So we give them a shot at the cadetship. And a number of them made very, very good journalists. They didn't go to university. They didn't have degrees, but they were good at the profession.
Absolutely. And we were discussing off air things like the Balltampering saga, because in the book, you talk about when you moved into public relations, dealing with crisis situations and how important it is to just tell the truth.
Absolutely, Marnie. I mean, because of my background as a journalist, I knew exactly what happens when a journalist suspects that somebody is either lying about an incident that's happened or is trying to conceal facts. It merely piques his interest 100% more than if the person who's on the receiving end of the bad publicity turns around and says, right, okay, it happened. We're terribly sorry it happened. These are the reasons why it happened. This is what we've done about it. And this is what we intend doing to make sure it doesn't happen again. In other words, you front up. You don't try and conceal. You don't say no comment, because all that does is to make sure that the journalist tries harder and harder. But I'm not sure that today's journalists are doing that, or at least most of them.
Absolutely. And I know, having worked in crisis and emergency media myself, we used to always run on Rudolph Giuliani's theory from September 11, which was tell them what you know, tell them what you don't know, tell them what you're going to do about what you don't know, and tell them what you want them to, tell them what you want them to do.
Yeah, perfect. Because apart from anything else, it leaves the journalist with nowhere to go. You've answered all his questions in one statement. Where does he go from there? He's got no lies to follow up. He's got no obfuscation or no comment response to deal with. He's absolutely nowhere to go. And that really, I think, is the answer in almost all cases of crisis management.
Absolutely. And when I used the Balltampering saga when we were off air, I think I said to you, if they had have just come out and said, we're really sorry, we shouldn't have done that. What we did isn't cricket. And to the little kids out there who are watching us and idolizing us, we didn't do the right thing. We made a really poor choice, and this is what we'll do in the future.
Exactly. And right there and then, the story would have been deflated. There would have been no film of Steve Smith breaking into tears or Warner wandering off with his children. I mean, none of that would have happened because it would have been dealt with right at the start. It's appalling what we've done. We're terribly sorry. It'll never happen again, etc. And it just leaves the journalist with, there's no other avenue to pursue the story because it's all over.
Absolutely. And we were also talking about the demise of journalism in general. We were talking about Frankston having lost the Frankston Standard Leader as a published paper. What is happening? Like, obviously the internet has had an impact on that. But do you think it's the quality of journalism as well that's impacted?
Yeah, I think it is to an extent, because if the quality of journalism is less than it was, inevitably people are going to buy less papers than they used to. But I think probably more importantly than that, as you said, the internet and television news, of course, has replaced the need to buy a newspaper to an extent. There have also been the closures enforced by the COVID outbreak. And before the COVID outbreak, because the internet provided an outlet for a lot of the advertising revenue that newspapers relied on, without that revenue, they just simply didn't keep going. So we have seen the demise in Australia of so many local, suburban, country newspapers that were the lifeblood of their local communities. They were the only source for information that those communities had, and they're gone. And it is an absolute tragedy. And I'm at a loss to know what can be done about it, because you just don't get that kind of grassroots service either from the internet or from, for instance, for television. So we are diminished by this lack of media.
Absolutely. Now, reflecting back on your book and your time at Truth, you broke some incredible stories, that hit the front page of Truth. And one of my favorites, I think, from the book was uncovering the whereabouts of Vladimir Petrov after 30 years of being in hiding.
Well, I was very lucky you're always lucky with the big ones. You always have to have an element of luck with the big ones, Marnie. And with Petrov, I had I'll go back a wee bit further. Paul Edwards, the editor I mentioned earlier, had a very odd philosophy about assigning people to particular rounds being the area of journalism in which you work. For instance, we only had one Jewish reporter on the paper, and he was put in charge of the Nazi affairs. I was the only reporter on the paper who didn't own a television, so I was made the television critic. And as a result of that, I used to phone television program PR people and say, I want to talk to you about such and such a program. And there'd be an embarrassed silence on the end of the line. And then the person would say, why are you asking me about that? It's not on our channel. It's on such and such a channel. And I'd say, well, it's because I don't have a television. And they'd say, well, why are you the television critic? And so on. Anyway, as a result of this, I made a connection with quite a high-profile television personality who laughed like a drain when I told him I didn't have a television. He vowed at that point to help me, and we made good friends over the years. And he gave me a lot of good stories. And then one day he phoned me up and he said, would you like to interview Vladimir Petrov? And I said, what? And he said, look, you can, and I can get you in to see him where he is, but only on the condition that you don't tell him you know who he is, and you don't tell him that you're a journalist. And I said, well, how can I possibly interview? He said, well, it's up to you. If you want to do it, those are the conditions. And I had such regard for him that there was no way I was going to break those conditions. So I spent an entirely fruitless 10 minutes with him talking about the weather and the bunch of flowers that I'd brought him. And I wrote a story saying truth has broken the veil of secrecy surrounding Russian defector Vladimir Petrov, etc. And at that time, Murdoch owned the paper, and one of his senior executives in News Limited in Sydney was on the D-Notice Committee. Now, you know what the D-Notice Committee is all about. It's stopping or censoring journalism that may affect the national security. So as a result of that, the story never saw the light of day. Maybe 4 or 5 years later, when Mark Day and Owen Thompson had taken over Truth, the Petrov papers were about to be made public. And Mark Day remembered that I'd had this story killed by the D-Notice Committee. And he said, why don't you go back and see if you can find him? And it was, as I say, 3 or 4 years later, and the place where he was a hospital, and it was an absolute maze of corridors and various floors. And I went in with a photographer called John Murray, and what we planned on doing was establish his whereabouts if we could, and then going back and getting a camera, which John would conceal under his coat, and going in to photograph him. But I was very concerned that here's an old man, a very frail old man, who's been waiting for the KGB to burst into his room and shoot him for the last 20 or 30 years. And here we are, we're going to burst into his room and shoot him with a camera. So I phoned my then editor, Jeff Hawthorne, and told him about this. And he said, oh, look, you'll think of something, which was always the response of an editor when he wasn't able to help you. So I went in first. We finally found his room, and it took a long time. Went back to get the camera. And John, who liked a beer, said, we're going for a beer. And I turned to him, I said, John, this is the most important story you will take in your life. And he said, I know it is. That's why we're going for a beer. So we went for a couple of beers. He hid the camera under his coat, and we went back in. And we walked into the room. I walked in first. I said, Mr. Petrov, no, I called him by his pseudonym, which was Sven Allison, which was partly why we were pretty sure it was him. I said, Mr. Allison, a man's going to follow me into the room and he's going to take your photograph. You're in no danger. And at that stage, he started not screaming, but moaning in a high-pitched voice. And John came in with a camera, one of those automatic cameras that take 30,000 pictures in a second, and started clicking away. And I'm saying, John, come on, we've got to get out of here. And there's doctors and nurses running from all over the ward. And finally, John had got what he needed. Well, he thought he had, because in those days, you couldn't look at a camera straight away. You had to wait until you got to the dark room. So off we went, and we prepared an escape route involving commercial lifts and that sort of thing. We got out of the place, and we got back to the office, and John developed his pictures. And the whole newsroom, editors and sub-editors, a lot were waiting on the results. And the pictures were great. And then Jeff Hawthorne, the editor, and quite rightly said, how do we know for sure that this is Vladimir Petrov? And there was no way I could answer that other than to say that, well, we do know that his name was Sven Allison because that was in his room. And we do know that Sven Allison purports to be the name that he was going under. And then somebody said, well, hang on, he's got a tattoo on his hand of an anchor in the little space between his thumb and forefinger. So we found some very, very old pictures around the time that he defected, and there was the anchor tattoo, much clearer. So we knew we'd got the right man. But yeah, it was a long, long saga. Well, nearly as long as it took me to tell the story. But yeah, it was a big one, because I think any journalist in Australia would have given his right arm to have found Petrov, and I owed it entirely to this really good contact in the television industry, whose name I've never revealed and never will, bless his heart.
Oh, there's a part of me that goes, go on, say it, but completely understand. We wanted the scoop, but that's okay. We get it. Now, I guess one of the most important stories that you wrote about in your time for Victoria was the use of Agent Orange herbicides by Victorian government employees. It was resulting in cancer deaths. I vaguely remember, I would have been quite young when that happened. But what was that like, exposing those and then dealing with the outfall of that?
Oh, look, it was it was horrifying mainly because of the government's indifference. I mean, just as background, Marnie, what was happening that the Lands Department, which was responsible for spraying, was sending workers out into the field armed with backpacks, which were full of 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D, which were the main ingredients for Agent Orange, which, as you know, was used to defoliate the jungles of Vietnam during the Vietnamese War. Now, these blokes would go out into the field in the morning, spray all morning, then they'd sit down and have their lunch, usually out of a bag or a tin that they'd taken with them. No facilities for washing their hands, and then they'd continue after lunch more spraying. Now, as a result of this, there were these little areas where 5 or 6 blokes were all contracting cancer, and they were all Lands Department workers, and they all worked at spraying. And we were running these stories. I remember going to Nil. I don't know how to pronounce Nil, N-H-I-L-L.
I think it's just Nil, yeah.
Yeah, that'll do. And I think there were 7 victims that I uncovered in Nil, all of whom were either at death's door or had died. And we started running these stories, and Vasey Horton, who was then the Lands Department minister, kept on denying it and saying, no, it's perfectly safe. And we were running pictures of cows with 2 heads that had been born on farms in Gippsland as a result of spraying. And nobody would take us seriously. Then it started getting raised in federal parliament, some of the stories that we wrote. And in the end, there was an acceptance that this was not a chemical that should be used in this manner. But it was too late for many of these people.
Absolutely, absolutely. And along those same lines, the effects of British A-bomb tests at Maralinga.
Yeah,
so the effects on Native Australians and our servicemen. You covered that as well.
That was absolutely appalling. One of the first things I found out about that was that after the bomb tests at Maralinga, signs were erected in the desert saying, beware of this area, it's ground zero and it's hideously contaminated, don't go near here. Now, the Aborigines who are living in that area, they could read the clouds, they could read movements of birds and lizard tracks on the sand, but they couldn't read English. So these signs were utterly meaningless to them. More importantly, ground zero was warm, so it was a place to camp. And as a result of this, there were many, many casualties. And these figures have never, ever been released. I was fortunate enough, after I wrote the first stories, to get in touch with a man, again, who shall remain nameless, who was very, very good at getting information for me. He became my deep throat on this series. And we uncovered the most incredible, the way that the Australian servicemen were discriminated against was horrifying. There was a photograph, for instance, of a British scientist in full head-to-toe protective gear with a pair of tongs about 10 feet long, and he was receiving from an Australian serviceman dressed in singlet and shorts and bare hands the canister off an aeroplane that had just flown through the mushroom cloud. So not only was there an ignorance of the effects of radiation, I mean, it goes on and on. There was a South Australian scientist called Hedley Marston who suspected that what was happening was very detrimental to the safety of Australians. And the only way you can find out about fallout, or one of the most accurate ways you can find out about fallout, is from the thyroid glands of sheep. So he went right along the south of Australia and then up the eastern seaboard as far as Brisbane, buying sheep, taking out their thyroid glands and examining them. And he put in a report saying that that entire area had been heavily polluted, but with radiation. The government didn't suppress this and didn't allow him to publish the thing. So he went and did it all over again. Later, still found the same results. I can't remember whether he suicided or whether he just died of a broken heart, but his findings never got out. And I managed to trace his secretary in Adelaide when I was doing this story, and she gave me all the details about him. So we were able to publish that in a book that I later wrote with the radiation protection officer at Melbourne University, Rob Robotham. We did the first book on the Maralinga test, which certainly revealed the duplicity and political manoeuvring that were behind the tests. Absolutely. But it was a sad day.
And it just really scares me with the way journalism's going, that to me, I mean, it's called the fourth estate for a reason. It
Mm.
holds governments and organizations and people to account.
Yep.
And who does that? Who tells these stories to the public when there's nowhere left to tell it?
Well, I mean, I suppose Watergate is probably the supreme example of that. Without Watergate, Nixon would have gone on with his criminal skullduggery. I mean, we've still got Four Corners, which quite often reveals facts that those in power don't want revealing. And we've got papers like the Saturday Paper and the Guardian, which do the same. But I don't think in general we have a sufficiently questioning media. I think most journalists now rely on the internet. If they want to know something, they press a button, and that's not the way to go, because the information on the internet is not only quite often inaccurate, it's quite often biased, and it's coming from a particular point of view. And the only way that you can get to the real reason behind the story is to do your research, to get out there and talk to the people who've been affected, talk to the people or try and talk to the people who are committing the offences against nature. But and it's not happening enough nowadays. It really isn't. I mean, how in God's name has Trump managed to survive as long as he has in America?
Don't even.
No, don't even go there.
Don't even go there. I think that's beyond all our comprehension, to be honest.
Having said that, Marnie, he is incredibly entertaining. I mean, I think he is one of the most despicable human beings that's ever walked the planet. He's racist, he's misogynist, he's everything you want to say, and he's got a live furry animal on top of his head. But apart from that, you know, whenever he's on television, I can't turn it off. I just find him fascinating.
And I must say, I head over there quite often. And the number of times I've had people, when they realise I'm Australian, say to me, you know, we're not all like that, don't you? Like most of us voted for Hillary. Like, we didn't all vote for Trump. It's just our system. Now, Adrian, I think you may have frozen.
Oh,
that's right. I can still hear you though.
Oh, okay.
Let's keep going and it might catch up.
Okay. Yeah, look, I can understand why people in America would say that to you, Marnie. I would be so deeply ashamed to be American at the moment. Quite apart from Trump, there's just.
I think we might have lost you. We did have a few technical difficulties before we came on air. So.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I've got you back.
Oh, great.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, I was just talking about what's happening in America at the moment, and I'm afraid they're on a slippery slide to nowhere, apart from the fact that half of them are dying from COVID because of Trump's total failure to address it. And I mean, his denial. Oh, you know, we have the greatest record in the world. We're on top of it. Everything's going to be okay. I mean, it's as if.
Oh, I think we've lost you again. Ugh. Hopefully we'll get you back. Oh, you're coming in and out.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got you.
I don't know what's happening. Did you get any of that? Or?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, I was talking about Trump in terminally. Yeah, look, maybe he's got some gremlins in the machine, and every time we talk about him, it shuts itself off. Maybe we should.
Maybe it's probably got nothing to do with the wind up your way, or.
It's Trump. Everything's Trump's fault.
We're being censored. Now, I must say, Adrian, I don't know right now if you can hear me or not, but I must say what I loved about your book was the love that you had with your second wife, Anne.
Yeah, so I've got you back.
Beautiful. Did you hear my whole question?
No, I didn't hear any of it.
Okay, I've got you. So what I did love about the book, and it was a constant story through it, sitting aside from everything, was the love that you had for your second wife, Anne. And the fact that at 18 years old, she took a leap of faith and got back on a boat and went back to England for you. Yeah,
look, a great deal of what I wrote about Anne and I was taken out of the book by the editors at Simon & Schuster. And I guess probably wisely, because it was it was very intimate and it was very personal. I mean, the stuff that I wrote about her death, in a way, was well, it was traumatic, but it was necessary. But yeah, look, she was the only. I mean, we worked together for 44 incredibly happy years, and she was the only thing that kept me sane. I'd sometimes come home after a day at Truth and feeling as if the whole world was falling apart. And she was always such a strength, and she always had an instinct for the right thing. And there were only a couple of times when she ever showed displeasure at my professional life, and one was my association with the Hells Angels. That worried her deeply. And I think there are a couple of other occasions where she was, oh yeah, well, there was one occasion when I got thrown out of a restaurant in Canberra, and the photographer took a photograph of me being thrown out. And he printed a copy when we got back to the office for me, and I took it home and I left it on the coffee table in the sitting room when Anne and I went to bed, and we were woken by our two little boys, who were then aged 6 and 4. And the elder one was clutching the photograph, and they were both in tears, and they were saying, "Why is this man hurting Daddy?" And she wasn't very pleased about that. So I never took any more of those sort of photographs home after that. But yeah,
I think my favourite story was when you were travelling, when you guys were working on the film with the Hells Angels, or the footage with Hells Angels, and you got yourself, well, not yourself into a spot of bother, but there was a spot of bother, and you called her and said, "Can you please come and pick me up?" Because of course you don't drive. And she turned around and said, "You got yourself into this mess, you can get yourself out of it."
Absolutely. And that was Anne. God, it's wonderful that you picked that, Marnie. That was Anne.
I loved it.
Well, it was Anne personified. I mean, she was always no nonsense. She didn't suffer fools gladly. She, as I say, she resented the fact that I spent a fair bit of time around the Hells Angels and visited their clubhouse on a fairly regular basis. And she said, "This is going to end in tears." So you're quite right. I was on a run with them, and we were in a pub in Broadford, and it was a horrible fight outside, and it really shook me up watching the violence. And so I phoned her and said, "Look, I've had enough of this. Can you come and get me?" And no, as you so rightly say, she said, "No, you got yourself into it. You get yourself out of it." And that's why I loved her so much.
I must say, I was actually telling my crew back at work about it yesterday, and I said to them, Adrian has given me strength that kind of love exists. Like the love that feels like home and the love that grounds you, it exists.
Marnie, that is so sweet, and that is so lovely to hear that, because I think probably the greatest compliment that Anne and I were ever paid was by a dear friend who we hadn't seen for many years, and he came to stay with us. And after he'd been with us for a couple of days, he said, "I know what it is that's successful about your relationship. It's still under negotiation. In fact, it's renegotiated daily." And that was absolutely true. And it was why it was such a vibrant and successful relationship, I guess, because neither of us ever took anything for granted. We had a very deep respect and love for each other at the bottom of it all. But we could be, well, as he said, we were always either rowing or cuddling, one or the other. So it was, it was a very lively relationship.
No, I absolutely loved being able to be given a window into that as part of this book. So I thought it was definitely a thread through the whole book, and I'm so glad that you were able to include it.
Well, bless you for that. That means a great deal to me, because, as I say, probably 2/3 of what I wrote about Anne was taken out, which annoyed me at the time. I didn't have any choice other than to agree. And I've since had that version of the book printed for myself, so that I could have a record of all those sort of things. But yeah, it was a theme that ran throughout my life, whether it was at Truth or other occupations. And I was incredibly fortunate to meet somebody like her, and to have nearly half a century with her.
Absolutely. Now, you were talking about the fact that she didn't really approve of your friendship, we'll say, with the Hells Angels over, what was it, I think about 4 years.
3 years, roughly.
But you were also acquaintances with Kath I'll say Pettingill. Is that how I
That's
say
it. That's it. Yep.
So Granny Evil, you wrote
Yep.
her story as well.
Yeah. Now, Kath Pettingill, for those who may not remember, she was the matriarch of a family of 10 children, 3 of whom were dead from heroin overdoses and underworld shootings, that sort of thing. Her eldest son, Dennis, was a mass murderer, $70,000 a week heroin dealer. She had seen and done some terrible, terrible things. I first became acquainted with her when she phoned the office one day to complain that 2 of her sons were being harassed by the police. They were little boys at the time. One of the 2 later was charged with the Wall Street police shootings, Trevor Pettingill. Anyway, I did a little story on this and she was very grateful. And she started putting me onto all sorts of other stories involving the underworld. And as a result, I became pretty close to her in a lot of ways. And a lot of people would say, how can you possibly have anything to do with a woman like that? She, Granny Evil, she is evil. And I've always worked on the philosophy that we weren't put on this earth to judge people, firstly. And secondly, you treat people the way they treat you. And she has always been totally loyal to me. She never ever misses my birthday. Occasionally I'll get 3 cards all exactly the same stuck together because she shoplifts them and she just grabs them. And so quite often there'll be more than one. But I've got a lot of time for Kathy, and I always have had. And the other thing is that we've never formalized our relationship. Everything is done on, well, it wasn't even the shake of a hand. It's done on the fact that we trust each other. And as I say, a lot of people have said to me, well, you're crazy. She's a terrible woman. And she is, but there's another side to her which is warm and humorous and very courageous.
And I think you actually pinpointed it in the book when you then spoke about being approached by Rogerson, of all people, to write his book, where you declined to write that because you saw something in him that even Kath didn't have.
Exactly. Rogerson read The Matriarch and he phoned me out of the blue and he said, I want you to do the same thing for me. So I flew up to Sydney and I met him and his lawyer in the Siebel townhouse, and we had 2 hours together. And there was something very sinister about him. I mean, he was quite open. I started off by saying, well, look, the only way I'd be prepared to write a book about you is if you fronted up and told the truth. I'm not interested if you want to convey your side of things. I want you to be open. And I asked him if, in fact, he'd shot Wayne Lanfranchi, which was one of his most probably notorious police shootings. And he said, yes, I did, but not in the back, like people claimed. He was facing me when I shot him. Well, that impressed me, but not enough. And I made the right decision, because after I very diplomatically turned him down and said, no, look, I can't do it. I got too much else on. 2 years later, my phone rang late one night and it was Rogerson. And I can't even remember what he was complaining about, but he said, we know where you live and we may have to come and see you. And this didn't worry me too much because I was in Victoria, he was in Sydney, and I thought, well, he's not going to come all the way down here. But it was fairly typical of the man. And as I said in the book, I wasn't entirely heartbroken when he got a lengthy jail term for being an accessory to murder. So my brush with Rogerson was fortunately fairly brief.
Now, Adrian, you have achieved so much across your career. What would you say has been a highlight for you?
Oh gosh, there are a lot of things that I remember with huge affection. I think possibly the Tasman Bridge collapse was one of my favourites, because it was the way, again, a lot of luck involved, the way I got that story. For people who don't remember, the Tasman Bridge, I think it was back in about 70, probably late 70s anyway. What happened, a tug carrying a huge, not a tug, some sort of a boat carrying a huge load of concrete, I think it was, ploughed into one of the stands beneath the bridge, and the whole bridge collapsed, and there were cars literally hanging off the front end where it had collapsed. And I was got out of bed at 1 o'clock in the morning by Mark Day, who was phoning as Rupert's right-hand man from Sydney, and he said, you've got to get to Tullamarine Airport and then fly to Launceston, that's the first plane, and then hire a car and get down to Hobart. And I didn't have the heart to tell him that I couldn't drive. It didn't seem the right thing to do because I saw this as an opportunity. Anyway, cut a long story short, I got down there and I was fortunate that I managed to get a lift from Launceston to Hobart with Malcolm Rennie, who was one of the Bilbao Five who were murdered by, well, as you know that story. And he was a lovely bloke and he gave me a lift in the car that he'd hired. Didn't ask me to help him with the driving, thank God. Anyway, we got there and I filed my stories, early stories, and money was wired to us from Sydney. I had John Murray, the photographer, had arrived by then on a later plane. And I think from memory, it was $400. And John and I had a fairly vicious fight about who would have the money, because I'd already committed money to Malcolm Rennie for the hire car, money to somebody who allowed me to use their phone, money to a person who owned a boat so that we could take photographs from the water. And so I said to John, no, I'm in charge of this money. And we were in the back of the cab when all this happened, and he made a grab for the money, and we were fighting in the back of the cab, and we were ejected from the cab. Anyway, we made friends, and that night we went to the casino and lost every single cent of the money. And I went to bed suicidal. I thought, well, this is very clearly the end of my career. I can't pay Malcolm Rennie. I can't pay for the hire of the telephone. I can't, because there were no mobile phones in those days. I can't pay for the bloke for the boat. I can't pay for the hotel. What am I going to do? And at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, I got up and I just couldn't sleep. And I started walking the empty streets of Hobart. And earlier the previous day, with the media pack, I'd gone to the hospital where Captain Pellick, who was the captain of the ship that had ploughed into the bridge, where he was ensconced in a emergency ward. And of course, as a pack of journalists, we were not allowed anywhere near there, and we were all ushered out of the hospital. So it suddenly occurred to me as I'm walking the dawn streets of Hobart, people get woken up very early in hospital. I wonder if I could get in there now at 5 o'clock in the morning before anybody's on duty or before too many are on duty, and I can get in and I can get an interview with him. So I went into the hospital. I knew roughly where he was, and I was walking down the corridor very stealthily towards his room when I was grabbed from behind by this nurse, and she said, "Where do you think you're going?" And then she looked at me and she said, "I know who you are. You're one of those bloody journalists that was in bothering everybody yesterday. Get out of here." So I spilled the beans to her, and I told her what had happened at the casino the night before, and she pretty well said, "Well, tough luck, not my problem." And I threw myself on her mercy, and I said, "Just give me 5 minutes with her." She said, "No, it's more than my job's worth." So I tried again, and I said, "How about if I wrote some questions down on a piece of paper and you took them into him and get him to see if he wants to answer them?" "All right," she said, and she bundled me into this room. She said, "Wait here and don't go out of this room." Anyway, I was there for about 20 minutes, and I thought, she's forgotten all about me. This is not going to work. After 20 minutes, the door opened. She handed me this piece of paper, and she said, "He's not answered all your questions, but there's some answers here." I looked at it, and the question, what happened, there it was, his answer, that he'd radioed for a tug, he'd lost his steering. And I got the front page lead of every paper in Australia over that. And I'll never forget, I was part of the media pack the following day when the Daily Mirror arrived from Sydney. And I had this big byline by Adrian Tame on the front. And one of the TV reporters said, who the F is Adrian Tame? And I said, "That's me. Can I have my paper, please?" That was a great moment. So yeah, probably that was one of the stories that I was most happy about. But as you could see, there was a great deal of luck involved, Marnie.
Absolutely. And quick thinking, really. It's thinking outside the square, almost guerrilla tactics.
Well, I mean, I was desperate. I really was desperate. If this nurse hadn't helped me, and if she's still alive today, as I said in the book, I'm still madly in love with her. She got me a promotion. She got me a pay rise. I was made news editor as a result of this. Yeah, and I guess desperation led me to continue to badger her and beg her to get me some sort of access to him, and it worked.
Absolutely. After all, we're all human.
Yeah. Well, she certainly was.
Now, tell me, Adrian, if readers take one thing away from the awful truth, what do you hope that will be?
Oh gosh, I hope that they would. I hope more than anything that they're amused because um, I had more fun professionally and in many ways personally at Truth than I've ever had anywhere else in my life. And I tried to convey that impression of what an incredibly amusing, entertaining, wonderful place it was to work. So if they can take away that, the atmosphere of the place and the feeling about the place, the warmth that we had between us. I mean, we bonded very strongly on the editorial floor because partly because of a siege mentality, we were regarded as the lunatic fringe, drug addicted, drunken journalists who really didn't belong in the profession. The rest of the profession had no time for us whatsoever, and this is why we were probably one of the reasons why we were so close. So if I've got that across, I'd be very happy. If people can take that away from the book, that'll satisfy me. That'll do me.
Absolutely. And I must say, we do have to wrap it up, but I must say, even the mention of journalists who are still operating today, quite famously, of getting into the back of their van at lunchtimes. Like it's I was gobsmacked. It's a completely, the 70s were a very different time.
They certainly were. Marnie, your question's been absolutely magnificent, and it's the best interview by a long way that I've done. And I'm most grateful firstly, for the opportunity and the obvious commitment that you've made to reading the book. I really am grateful.
Oh, thank you so much, Adrian. That means so much. And I was very much looking forward to, as a PR and journalism trained and PR professional, I absolutely loved your book. I was looking forward to reading it, and you didn't disappoint. And I think one of the things that I really loved out of it, other than the general stories, of course, was also how during the strike of the Herald, you were able to really show us what Murdoch is like as a man, like as a
Yes,
newsman, when he is on that floor and working just as hard or harder than everyone else to get a job done. It was to me the epitome of leadership, and very much I don't have an opinion of him generally, of Rupert, but
absolutely.
just that he was leading by example, and he didn't ask any of you to do anything when when the Truth newspaper became a daily for 3 or 4 days. He didn't ask you to do anything that he wasn't prepared to do himself.
And that is why we for those 3 days, 3 or 4 days, Marnie, the average member of the editorial floor worked 22 hours a day. Now, we didn't have any great grudge against the Herald Sun, and that was why the strike paper was bought out, because Herald Sun was on strike. We didn't have any particular loyalty to Murdoch. Like you've just said, a lot of us had a fairly dim view of some of his tactics, but it was the inspirational side of what he did. I mean, he did every single aspect of the newspaper, from taking down stories on the phone to writing them to subbing them. He played a role in every single step of newspaper production. And if we worked 22 hours, he worked 23 hours a day. So it was very hard not to be inspired by that. But the sad end to that story is that at the end of the 3 or 4 days, he stood up on a table, and I swear this is true. He had a tear in his eye, and he said, "I'll never forget what any of you have done during this period. You've all gone way above the call of duty, and I'll never forget any of you." 6 months later, 5 of the people who he'd never forget were made redundant.
Mm.
And I phoned, as news editor, I phoned one of his right-hand men in Sydney and said, "Hang on a minute, you can't do this. Rupert said he'd never forget us," and I would put in my box very quickly, "If Rupert says it, it happens."
That was very disappointing. I must say,
Very.
I had him up on a pedestal, and then a
Over
page
3
later, I was like, "Really, mate?"
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, Murdoch, I suppose, got where he is today by being ruthless.
business is business, I guess.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Adrian.
It's a great pleasure, Marnie. I've really enjoyed it. I really have.
Wonderful. Well, Adrian's books are available to borrow via our online library, which you can access for free with your Frankston City Libraries membership via our website. If you're not a member, you can sign up on our website today and have immediate access. You can also pop the physical books on reserve now and organise them for click and collect. You can also purchase The Awful Truth from Robertson's Bookshop. And when we share this video across our social media channels, we'll include a link directly to Adrian's books. Keep an eye on the Frankston City Library's website. We've got a heap of great Frank Talks coming up. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Frank Talk with Adrian Tame for Frankston City Library.